Okay, thank you. Good morning. The lives of slaves in the Mamluk Empire were divided into three distinct periods of time: the time before slavery, slavery itself, and the time after slavery. When we think of slaves, we tend to think only of their lives and their labor in the period of their lives in which they were enslaved. But in the Mamluk case, most slaves were in fact born in freedom and they died in freedom. In this paper, I'm going to explore these three stages of life and how they were connected to one another. A crucial aspect of the slaves' perception of time was the social death they suffered at the hands of their captors when they were enslaved. They lost their families, friends, and environment and had to adjust to a foreign world into which they were transplanted. In this new world, they gradually built up the skills, the experience, and the social bonds that they needed to survive and to thrive. Most were enslaved at an early age, spent most of their working lives in slavery, and many were able to bargain for their freedom using the skills and the social capital that they had acquired during their time of servitude. Their emancipation was a social rebirth that came towards the end of their lives. The first part of a slave's life was the time before his or her enslavement. Most slaves came from the steppes of what is now southern Russia or from Ethiopia. It was easier to capture and transport women and children than men, which is the main reason that children and adolescents made up the bulk of slaves that were imported into the empire. We know from the records kept by the Genoese at Kaffa, which was their colony in Crimea, that most slaves were sold when they were between the ages of 10 and 15. You don't have to worry about the price too much here, but as you can see, there is a clear concentration in terms of age between 10, 15, maybe 20. Unfortunately, we have no comparable data for Egypt or Syria because much fewer documentary sources have survived. But this data that this graph is built on is probably a good indication of how old newly imported slaves in the Mamluk Empire were. Most of these slaves were either Caucasians or Turks, and the Genoese were deeply involved in the slave trade from Crimea to Egypt and Syria via the Aegean Sea. Quite a few of these slaves in this graph probably ended up in Cairo. For these young slaves, a completely new time of their life began. The break was complete because they were separated from their families, given new names, and found themselves in an alien environment in which they could not even speak the language, be it Italian, Greek, or Arabic. We can see this in the account of a Mamluk officer at court who told a chronicler of his early life. This man, called Baisari, was interviewed by the chronicler Ibn Shaddad about the origin story of Sultan Baibars. Don't worry, I'm not going to read that all out, but you can read it in the background. So he said that Baibars was captured during a Mongol incursion at the age of 14, which is consistent with the data from Kaffa that I just showed. He was then sold via the Anatolian land route, so not by sea, and passed through Sivas and Aleppo on his way to Cairo. This point in a slave's life was a crucial time. The rest of his working life would depend on who bought him. His career and social status depended on his master. For example, Ibn Tahribirdi writes that Baibars was first sold to a craftsman in Damascus. If he had not been sold on to Cairo, he would have led a very different life. Baibars was very lucky. He was bought as a military recruit, his owner helped his career, and he rose quickly through the ranks. But most slaves served in menial positions in modest households and never had a chance to rise so dramatically. Women and black people, for example, almost always became domestic servants. The second part of a slave's life was the time in which he or she served his or her master directly. They began this service with few skills and with no social capital. By skills and social capital, I mean the artisanal, martial, scribal, or artistic skills that a slave might acquire, and the mutual loyalty of slave and master that was often enshrined in limited legal protection for the slave. I'm going to focus on two particular aspects here: the so-called Catawba contract for slave artisans and the Walad status for slave mothers. Both were legal constructs that reflect social reality and usually led to the liberation of the slave after a certain amount of time. Again, I'm not going to read that out, but it is something that's necessary for you to see in order to follow my arguments. So these are two default formulas for slave contracts. These contracts allowed slaves to use their own marketable skills to earn money and then buy their freedom in installments. As far as I know, and please correct me on this, we have a few experts on documents here. As far as I know, no physical examples of such contracts have survived. But these formulas are taken from a 15th century scribal manual that was written for the people who wrote these contracts on a regular basis. And I think that these formulas closely resemble the actual documents as they were written. The manual is by Shihabuddin al-Asyuti at the bottom there. So you can see from these examples that such contracts were very specific about the amount of time for which slaves would remain in slavery before they were freed. The minimum was probably around a year, but this period of limbo, legal limbo, could perceivably last for up to a decade. Nevertheless, the slave had a goal in mind, and he would strive to earn enough money to buy his freedom. I believe that these kinds of arrangements were widespread, partly because Mamluk Hisba manuals explicitly forbid the sale of contracted slaves. These contracts were used to motivate slaves to work better, and by that I mean that they were supposed to maximize artisanal production and commercial profit for the benefit of their owner. My point here is that the slave first learned the trade, and after a few years, he was deemed valuable enough to motivate him with the promise of freedom. So over time, he changed his legal and social status using the skills and experience he had won in his new life in slavery. The period of legal limbo specified in the contract also influenced his perception of time, because he had now entered a phase of his life where he was half free and half slave. Of course, the owner could also free him without any monetary compensation. The documentary record shows that that also happened quite regularly, particularly in scholarly circles. A few more excerpts from this scribal manual here. The situation was different for women. It was frowned upon to give them a Catawba contract, mostly because prostitution was seen as the most likely way for them to earn money. The scribal manual does contain formulas for contracts for women, so it did happen, but I think that those were much less common. The most common way for female slaves to earn their freedom was by giving birth to the children of their master. This gave them the status of Walad, which brought with it limited legal protection and freedom upon their owner's death. This meant, of course, that the master had to die before they were free. And this excerpt is taken from the same scribal manual. I'm showing it here because it summarizes the fiqh position on slave mothers in a convenient way, the bottom one here. As you can see, slave mothers could not be sold or otherwise given away, and this ensured that the owner could not sidestep the provision that they would be later freed simply by selling them off before or by giving them to a family member as a gift. And this is one of the default formulas to testify to the legal status of a slave mother. You can see here from the text that it was awarded regardless of whether the child lived or not. It is also interesting to note that mustawlada is used synonymously with walad in these documents. Reaching this status was an important step for female slaves towards gaining their freedom. As in the case of the work contracts that I showed before, reaching this legal status gave the slave a new outlook on life. From this point onwards, it was only a question of time before she would be free. I think that it was also common to liberate older female slaves when they reached a certain age, partly because that was the pious thing to do, and partly because old age meant that they couldn't work hard enough anymore to justify their upkeep in the household. So, I have pointed out two ways in which slaves could build a new life after their enslavement. Firstly, by skilled work, and secondly, by having the child of their owner. If they lived long enough, these ways led to their freedom. This brings us to the third part of a slave's life. This was the time after their slavery. This pie chart shows how many slaves and freed slaves I counted in the attendance list of Hadith lectures from Damascus in the Sama'at. I think we have a talk on that tomorrow, actually. So there are a lot of variables that could have influenced the resulting ratio of slaves and freed slaves, but I can't get into that right now. And this data is nevertheless an important indicator of how many slaves were eventually manumitted by their owners. It suggests that for every 2 or 3 slaves, there was one slave who had been liberated by his or her owner and now lived as a free man or woman. Considering that manumission usually took place later in life and that life expectancy tended to be quite low, that's a surprising amount of freed slaves. So at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that the initial enslavement was a social death. I'm following Orlando Patterson. And that the eventual manumission was a social rebirth. This divides the slave's life into 3 distinct time periods: time of slavery, the before, and the after. But after the liberation, there was only a partial rebirth, actually. Manumitted slaves were still tied to their previous masters, both socially and legally. The master could lay claim to a certain part of the inheritance of his former slave, for example. This attachment is also the reason why I was able to trace the freed slaves in the Sama'at. They're always listed as the clients of their former masters. The socioeconomic status of the master also determined how well his liberated client would live. Rich and powerful masters were more likely to look after the welfare of their clients than poor craftsmen. And I mentioned earlier that older slave women were often freed because they couldn't work hard enough anymore and the owner wanted to rid himself of an extra mouth to feed. That was another way that a slave might gain her freedom. I'm using the feminine form here because nearly all of the documents I found that attest to this refer to women. I have found several dozen estate inventories of freed slaves, and that's a form of will. And they come from a 14th century Shafi'i court archive in Jerusalem, the collection of the Al-Haram al-Sharif. You see an example of that here. Most of these testaments include only things of very little value, like torn clothes and household items in bad condition. In many cases, the heirs of the slaves were the children that she had with her previous owner. These inventories show that most freed slaves lived in poverty at the end of their lives. In this case, the slave mother Ghazal continued to live in the household of her previous owner after he had manumitted her. When she died, their son and daughter inherited her entire property, which amounted to a shirt, 2 blankets, and a carpet, all of which was old and in a bad condition. Her master, Shihab ad-Din, must have decided to free her of his own accord before his own death, so before she was legally entitled to be freed. He did not kick her out, and she continued to live in this house as the mother of his children. She probably led a very similar life in freedom as she had in slavery. So, The break between the second and the third period in a slave's life was more abrupt in the case of slaves freed by employment contracts, by Catawba contracts. Their proven ability to procure large amounts of cash shows that they possessed the skills and the connections to become successful craftsmen or traders themselves. For them, age brought both freedom and the chance to build an independent existence. Let me summarize my argument. I have argued that the life of a slave in the Mamluk Empire consisted of 3 phases. Firstly, the time before they were enslaved. Secondly, the time during which they served their master as a slave. And thirdly, the time after their liberation, when they were free. The beginning of the second phase was a social death, while the third phase was a social rebirth, because they earned the legal right to act independently and to associate with whomever they wanted. It was through time, by gaining experience and skills, by raising children, or simply by reaching a certain age, that these slaves regained the liberty that they had lost at a young age. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really new perspective on slaves' life, especially after being freed.
Oh, okay. I have actually lots of questions for you, but I'll limit myself. One, this is, one is the critical role of acknowledgement of paternity in Walad. And my question, I have lots of questions about that, but just one specific question. Did you come across any examples of where its paternity is acknowledged, but then withdrawn at a later point? Because I've seen examples from the Abbasid period in the Kitab al-Aghan and other places. My other question has to do with the centrality of a kind of human infrastructure in slavery. This is a bigger question, but I mean, we have artisans, we have teachers, we have people who train, we have all the middlemen, but it'd be interesting to reconstruct that whole human infrastructure. In other words, all these people who are basically slave handlers and are moving them along their careers. So those interactions and those relationships, I think, are also very interesting to study. So.
Absolutely. About the first question about the acceptance of paternity, unfortunately, I don't have any actual documents. I just have these formulas. I haven't seen any formulas that allow a father to reject paternity afterwards. It's a very complex and completely unresearched topic because in my sources I do see slave reproduction where the children are born as slaves. And that's, in the few cases I found, is mainly because the father is unknown. And that could also mean that the father didn't accept the paternity. And in that case, the child is a slave and the mother is not an Walad. Presumably with the assumption that the father is also a slave.
But part of the point, though, is that it is part of the legal goings-on. I mean, that when these cases are decided, that's a critical piece of it, is that the father has to make that statement.
Yes.
And as I say, I have come across, I think, 2 cases where it's withdrawn. And I think that's interesting because it goes to the whole question of the stability of a slave's existence. In other words, you're tracking a biography essentially, but this is a block in the road, so to speak, where you're not going forward anymore. In fact, you've been thrown back into a previous status. If it's true, if these things did occur.
Maybe afterwards you can show me where you found it in the Kitab al-Arani, because that's hugely relevant for my project. Unfortunately, I don't have any Mamluk equivalents for that yet. I'm looking for it. The second question was about the infrastructure. The problem is that it's hardly documented. So we see slaves mainly when they're sold or bought and when they die. And the rest depends very much on the master. What does he want documented? How does he further the career of his slaves? But they're not very visible. So, yeah.
I agree, but nevertheless.
I'm looking for it.
So I have Elias first.
Thank you for your talk. Very, very interesting. I wonder whether social death Given what is often in comparative studies of slavery, the Middle Eastern slavery, especially in the Mamluk context, is often held out as an exception, is often, or at least is, we're urged to use caution when comparing historical examples of slavery. So I wonder whether social death carries with it too much baggage from the transatlantic context.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think it's still useful because the social death applied specifically to the people who came from outside the Islamic world. It doesn't apply to people who were born into slavery, but there are few of them. So especially the people from Ethiopia, who are perhaps a third of the slave population, they suffer a complete social death. They don't speak the language, they get a new name, and then the concept of a social rebirth is more problematic, but it is a different situation. I agree that you can't just apply the Atlantic slavery concept of social death without questions to the Middle Eastern one, but there are characteristics in Middle Eastern slavery which make it a viable approach to apply it with conditions, I think.
Thank you. Petre, please.
Follow up to the question before. For all the cases that you've encountered so far of Muslim owners, I'm asking the question in the context. I've worked in cases where non-Muslims, Jews or Christians, and that the slave brought to court the right for remission on the basis of conversion. But the issue was, and the parent would go along with that, not contest it, but the child, that they were very concerned about the future religion of their own child. And in the case I'm thinking of specifically was a Jewish owner. And that's where the case became really intense, of the right that make sure that the child remained with the Jewish religion. I was wondering though, are all the cases that you had, is it pretty much Muslim rather than not?
Just a quick counter question. Are you working with the Geniza records?
No, it's a chronicle. Ibn Yas was the one who brought it. And it was late. It was just around the time of the conference.
I'm very curious if you could show me afterwards the reference. I want to look at that. Yeah, so the information I have is nearly exclusively on a Muslim context because that's where we have the documents surviving. That's what the great majority of the literature is about, the fiqh, the scribal manuals, and the court records, first of all. So, yeah, it's exclusively Muslim what I'm doing.
So we have a last question. Torsten?
Yes. I want to come back to the social death because I also have my problems with that. At least in the way that you presented it, I understand it that like they suffer from social death in the place where they come from, but then like I think that the rebirth already happens at the same stage in this new place. And what I see in our text from the later period is that these slaves actually have their own social networks which allow them to flee and flee from their master at certain points. And I wonder why not contrast the Atlantic social death with like legal death or like legal death, rebirth, paradigm.
Well, I would maintain that they did suffer a social death because they lost all their connections, but the process of rebirth was not abrupt at manumission, but it started at the moment of enslavement. So as you said, they had networks, they had the opportunity to flee, but they had to build this up over time. So they built a new life, and it started when they were imported, because they got a new name, they made friends, they gained skills, and even though social death was complete, it only lasted for a minute, and then they started to build a new life. So yes, we have to adapt the concept, I agree.
I'm sorry, but I guess we have to get, or do we still have time? We have to proceed. So thank you once again, and maybe you go.